We would like to thank Kentucky American Water for being our presenting sponsor for the policy series for a number of years. They are terrific to work with, and at this point, I'm going to have Cheryl Norton, President of Kentucky American Water, to come to the podium to make a few remarks and to introduce our special guests. Cheryl.
Well, on behalf of Kentucky American, I want to say welcome to everyone here. As Bob said, we've been sponsoring this lunch for quite some time, and we really do enjoy being the sponsor of these public policy luncheons. Bob and his staff just do a tremendous job of getting really great speakers to come here. And, you know, the water business is a very local business, and that's one thing I've learned. I've been in the industry for nearly 30 years. Yes, I started when I was 5, but it really is, that's one thing I've really learned, is that water is a very local business. We try to do great things for the area. We just finished up with a river blast event in Frankfort that we helped to sponsor. We have another river blast event in Fort Boonesboro, or the Boonesboro area, coming up on August 1st. And to show how much we appreciate our customers and what they do, we're inviting all of our customers, we're inviting everyone here to come in for our annual Water Fest event. And that's going to be on August 4th, where you can come to our facility and you can kind of see what we do. You can see what's in the ground, things you don't normally see. And my staff does a really great job of taking care of people every day. And so we want you to be able to see kind of those underworkings of what's going on. So we'd really love to have you on August 4th, and you can look around town and you'll see things posted about the times and everything for that event. But when we talk about water being local, you know, when I first came to Kentucky about 4.5 years ago, I was kind of excited to find out that we had a senator in Washington that was so experienced and so good at what he did, and that he was showing real leadership in Washington. And then I was even more excited recently when he became really powerful in Washington, even more so. And so, you know, to be the majority leader in the Senate is just so exciting. And I just have tons of respect for Senator McConnell. And the great thing is that he remembers that politics are local also. And so he does things that are not just good for the United States, but he also does a lot of really great things for Kentucky. And so, Senator, we're thrilled to have you here today, and we really appreciate you taking the time. So we can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. As she indicated, I have a different title now than the last time I was before this group, and I have a humbling experience almost every day as a result of that. Someone described being the majority leader of the Senate as being a little bit like the groundskeeper at a cemetery. Everybody's under you, but nobody's listening. Last year I said during the campaign that I had enjoyed being the defensive coordinator. As you know, I'd been the leader of my party in the Senate for 8 years as the defensive coordinator. I know, of course, our state is basketball country, but if you ever pay any attention to football, you know the defensive coordinator can only score occasionally. The offensive coordinator gets to call the plays and has a better chance of putting points on the board. There were two issues I think that were really basic in last year's election. One was the standing of the president. People were not very happy with the president, and from our side's point of view, that was helpful. But there was another issue out there, and I know all of you must have felt it at some point, and that was the sense of dysfunction, as if sort of nothing ever got done. You may have been confused about where the dysfunction was, but there was dysfunction, and it was in the United States Senate. And there are two good ways of measuring dysfunction. One of them, as you can imagine, a legislative body, you're supposed to be voting. That's what you're supposed to do. In all of 2014, the entire year, we had 15 roll call votes on amendments on the Senate floor in the entire year. And this year, in the first half of the year, we've had over 130, most of them by the minority party, because I said if they made me the offensive coordinator, if the American people made me the offensive coordinator, we were going to get the Senate up and functioning and running again, and that meant the opportunity for both sides to have their input. Another way of measuring dysfunction is failure to pass a budget. The law requires us to pass a budget, but 4 of the last 5 years, the Senate didn't pass a budget. We've done that. Now, look, that's not nearly enough, but I can tell you the era of dysfunction in the Senate is over. There's a new majority with a different view about how to make progress for the country. Now, we do have divided government. But look, Americans seem to like divided government. We've had divided government more often than not since World War II. And I know it'll be a little bit counterintuitive to some of you, but divided government frequently has been pretty darn good. I'm going to give you some examples. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill raised the age for Social Security. There isn't anything harder to do politically than that. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did the last comprehensive tax reform. We need to do that again, but that was 30 years ago. Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress did welfare reform and actually balanced the budget 3 years in a row. So even though your first reaction to divided government is nothing's going to happen, it's really not true. But it does require whoever the president is to be somewhat pragmatic. In other words, to move to the center. And that's something this president only occasionally does. There's still a year and a half left. We'll see whether it arises again. But we did have an opportunity on trade to work together. It was almost an out-of-body experience. Here I was, aligned with the President of the United States against Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi. It was a lot of fun. Well, what is this about? I think there's always been a lot of confusion about trade because our friends over at the AFL-CIO, in order to try to make excuses for their own shortcomings, the fact that they are declining in membership in the private sector, seize upon the opportunity to blame other countries for their lack of membership. Completely and totally irrelevant. America is a trading nation. We have been since the founding of the country. We're good at it. Of the existing trade agreements that we have around the world, add up all of those countries with whom we have existing trade agreements, we have a $60 billion trade surplus. That means we sell $60 billion more to them than we buy back here. So we're good at trade. And so what this issue we were dealing with is about is a little bit technical. It's called Trade Promotion Authority. In other words, it was a process. This is a process that's existed off and on going back to Franklin Roosevelt. And it is a significant grant of power to whoever may be president at the moment, because it allows the president to enter into a trade agreement and to send it up to Congress for an up or down vote, no amendments. Now, why is that necessary? As you can imagine, if a trade agreement came up and it was amendable, I'd be trying to cut a special deal for bourbon or coal or tobacco. And multiply that all across the country, and you understand why no trade agreement would be approved without this authority. Now, I ran into people, plenty of them on my side of the aisle, said, why in the world would you give Barack Obama this kind of authority? My answer was, this is a 6-year trade promotion authority. This is not for any one president. It is for the presidency. And a year and a half from now, we may have a president we like better. And if you put a Republican in the White House, given the politics of trade among Democrats these days, you couldn't get trade promotion authority, because the two bases of today's Democratic Party, unions and environmentalists, hate trade agreements. And so the president really had a tough job and still was only able to get 28 Democrats in the House and 14 in the Senate to vote with us. That's how tough it is to be a Democrat these days when it comes to trade. So you put a Republican in the White House, you couldn't get TPA. So my argument to my colleagues was we need to get it now, or if we're lucky enough to have a Republican president a year and a half from now, he or she is not going to be able to have any trade agreements during the whole term. So it was good for the country, and it was an opportunity to make progress on some bipartisan issue, although it was only barely bipartisan because not many Democrats in Congress responded to the president's appeals. So what am I doing now in setting the agenda for this new Congress? Obviously, TPA is kind of an exception. Our current president is very, very left. In other words, he's not a centrist. This is not Bill Clinton. He's not looking for opportunities to move to the middle. So the opportunities to do things in the middle are not great. So what I'm doing is looking for things that we can agree on to see if we can make some progress for the country. And there are some. We did an Iran nuclear review bill. It's going to give us an opportunity to vote in Congress on the deal the president makes with the Iranians, if he makes it. I just mentioned Trade Promotion Authority. We're going to be able to do something on cybersecurity. We're going to be able to do something on highways. There are things that we can do. Unfortunately, I think it's going to fall short of what could be done in a time of divided government. The biggest challenges lying ahead for our country deal with the demographic changes in our country. We're living longer and longer and longer and better and better and better, and the older I get, the better I like that. And I'm sure all of you do too. But Social Security was passed in the 30s when the average American lived to be 61. Medicare was set at 65 in the 60s. Last year, the average male lived to be 79, the average female lived to be 81. If you don't make some adjustments to the eligibility, you tank the whole country because, as many of you know, about half the budget goes to Medicare and Social Security. Half of what we spend every year is on automatic pilot. Divided government would be the perfect time to engage and deal with these kind of eligibility changes. And the way you do it is the way that Reagan and O'Neill did it. When they raised the age to 67, it didn't take effect immediately. It's still ticking in 30 years later. So people have plenty of time to plan their retirement and to factor into that what they may be receiving from Social Security. That's the kind of grand deal that you would love to see come out of divided government, because divided government takes the politics out of it. I ran for the Senate the first time in 1984. The year before I got there was when Reagan and O'Neill did the deal on Social Security, raising the age. The fact that they did it together eliminated it as a political issue. I was never asked a single question in the entire '84 election about that. And that was just 1 year after they did it. So divided government has the potential to solve big problems for the country. And I'm hoping sometime before the president leaves office, we'll have a chance to tackle something even bigger than Trade Promotion Authority, which is certainly important. And so far, I think probably the most important thing we'll do this year. Looking to the future, I may talk about what we don't agree on. I think the president pretty clearly, he wouldn't have put it this way publicly, but I think he pretty clearly wanted to Europeanize our country. Well, why do I use that term? If you look to Western Europe, what do you see? Big debts, high taxes, overregulation, slow growth. You look at America today, big debts, high taxes, overregulation, slow growth. The single biggest complaint I get, not only in our state, but as I move around the country, is the regulatory onslaught that has affected virtually every single aspect of our economy. Whether it's healthcare, financial services, EPA, NLRB, FCC, you name the agency. They're coming down on the private sector with the view that if you're making a profit, you must be up to no good. And they're here to help you. They're here to help you. That, my friends, is the reason we're bumping along here with about a 2% growth rate when we need to be up between 3.5 and 4 to have the kind of country and the kind of opportunities for young people coming along that we need to have. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, I read the unemployment rate's only 5.4 or 5. That's figured on, on the basis of people looking for work. It's called the labor participation rate. The labor participation rate today is what it was in the Carter administration. And of course, the population is a lot bigger. That's how many people have just simply dropped out and given up and are depending on their relatives or government programs or anything they can find because they can't find a job. That's not the way to have a growing country. What we need to be is the best place in the world to do business, bar none. We got a lot of advantages. Your property's safe here, not going to be confiscated. We have the rule of law. This is an open society, an entrepreneurial society, but the government is making it very, very tough for us to do what we do best. A combination of overregulation and high corporate taxes export jobs. That's how you export jobs. Take the medical device tax in Obamacare, exporting jobs. So let me say a word about Obamacare. Just because the Supreme Court has upheld it twice doesn't mean it's a good thing. Not a single member of my party in the House or Senate voted for it, and we were right. What did we predict? We predicted higher premiums, higher co-payments, higher deductibles, more part-time workers, and mergers and acquisitions, as everybody tries to get bigger and bigger and bigger to deal with all the bigness coming their way. We may see that here in Kentucky soon. You've seen the rumors about Humana being gobbled up by somebody that's even bigger. This kind of government takeover of the private health insurance market, think of it this way. What Obamacare has basically done is taken the private health insurance market and turned it almost into a regulated utility. The government's now telling them what they can sell, and of course the choices aren't as good. And hospitals are now experiencing a new kind of uncompensated care. It's people who now have insurance, but they can't meet the co-payments and deductibles, so the end result is the same. And most of the figures that you've seen cited about additional people who are insured or Medicaid, the expansion of Medicaid represents most of the people who are newly covered. But the health insurance market, the private health insurance market, is in chaos. And at the end of the day, I guarantee you, everybody won't be insured. So the Supreme Court may have upheld it, but this issue isn't over. It will still be a big issue in the 2016 campaign. I believe whoever we nominate is going to want to undo as much of it as we possibly can to try to restore the kind of competition that we need to have in our country. So, the remaining year and a half of this administration, we're going to have big debates over spending. My members want to spend more in defense. Our friends on the other side want to spend more on everything. And so we'll be in some big arguments later in the year. But just because we have big arguments doesn't mean we ought not to focus on the things that we can agree on and try to get an outcome. You know, I'm approached frequently by people who say, it looks like you all don't like each other. I said, we don't have a collegiality problem. There's no collegiality problem, no matter what you may have concluded if you watch a lot of cable news. What we have is big-spirited debates about the future of the country. But I assure you, we haven't had a single incident like we had in the 1850s when a congressman from South Carolina came over and almost beat to death a senator from Massachusetts. No examples of that. In fact, our debates are pretty mild compared to what Jefferson and Hamilton called each other. What's different today is the internet and cable television, and you got it in your face all the time, and reporters have a tendency to want to personalize differences of opinion. So we don't have a collegiality problem. But there are big differences, not surprisingly, among Americans about what we ought to do in this country. We've always had those differences. But I'm upbeat and optimistic about the future. I always like to end before taking your questions with what Winston Churchill said about us, about Americans. He said, you know, the Americans, they always get it right after they've tried everything else first. And that's sort of how I view the last 6 years. And if you're someone who has, you know, my view of what America ought to be like, we're going to have an opportunity. The voters get to decide these things. We're going to have an opportunity next year to decide which direction to take. And I think it's going to be not terribly complicated. I think the Democratic nominee hopes that it will be so appealing to be the first woman president that that will carry the day. I think the Republican nominee is going to say something like this: if you're happy with where we are, you think the last 8 years have been just fine, then she's your candidate. But if you think America can do better by taking a different direction, I'm your candidate. I think this is going to be whether Americans want a third term for the current president or whether they want to go in a different direction. I'm hoping people are not satisfied with where we are now, and we have a chance to take that different direction. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, who'd like to lead off?
Senator, thank you for coming. Over here, to the right.
Yeah, there you are.
When the president came into office, he and the Environmental Protection Agency started coming after Kentucky coal pretty strong, so much so that we really have a war on coal. Right now in Kentucky, we have the potential of having a lot of new energy in that oil and gas through fracking. Do you see any indication that they're going to, I know there's been fracking for 100 years and they're pretty strong in, say, Pennsylvania, but do you see any indication that they're going to try to do everything they can to regulate that to, you know, perhaps non-existence as well?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but as you all know, the combination of hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling has revolutionized the American energy business. And I don't know how much exploitable shale we have in our state, but in New York, for example, they're not allowing it. So I think it'll be impacted by both local attitudes and the national government. But from the country's point of view, North America, Mexico, US, and Canada, we're just about energy independent. We're already the world's largest producer of natural gas as a result of this technology. Our energy picture is pretty bright. Now, they're in a downturn right now because of the low prices of oil, low price of oil. But of course, that's good for everybody else because the price of gasoline has gone down dramatically. But speaking of coal, coal has a future. The question is, does coal have a future here? That's the question. Coal clearly has a future because others are not going to go down this, engage in this quixotic venture that the president has us engaging in, which probably is going to have little or no impact on the issue of climate change. So we're having some big battles in Washington. The Congress has two tools when it comes to regulations. One is to write into bills that fund the government restrictions on what the government can do. And we're doing that in the Senate Appropriations Committee. The problem is, can we get those bills out of the Senate, because it requires 60 votes and I'm the leader of only 54. And even if we did, would the president sign it? So it's not at all sure we can stop him that way. The other avenue is in court, and there's been some relief in court, but as we were discussing here at the table, frequently litigation, by the time you get to some conclusion, even if it was something you wanted, everything's already happened. Like the Mercury ruling in the Supreme Court earlier this week was a good thing. The problem is lots of utilities have already adjusted, and the litigation comes after it's basically a fait accompli, and the course has already been chosen. Honestly, to stop the regulatory overreach, we need a new president. And that would apply not just to EPA, but to a whole lot of other agencies just simply running amok all across the country and squeezing the life out of so much of our economy.
Thank you.
Yep.
I say again, bring people to Seaboard. How likely is it that you can complete the federal highway transportation bill, a long-term bill? Do you think we'll get it by the end of the year? And if so, what do you think it'll look like?
I just mentioned the price of oil down, which is not great for the oil industry, but it's great for all the rest of us. There are a lot of people who advocate a gas tax increase. Let me make it very clear, the federal government is not going to pass a gas tax increase. And the reason I bring that up is because nobody has suffered more during the Obama years than the middle class and below. The average American family is $3,000 a year worse off now than they were when the president came to office. So when gas prices went down, it was like a tax cut for a whole lot of medium and low income people. I have a friend who runs a major fast food company in our country. He showed me a chart that had a direct correlation between his sales and the price of gas at the pump. As the price of gas at the pump went down, his sales went up. These are folks who are living on very little, very narrow margin. So we're not going to raise the gas tax. And the reason I bring that up, that obviously restricts what you do on the highway bill. For me, I would put more money into roads and bridges by ratcheting down what we do on mass transit and bike trails, which is also a part of the highway bill. But there are a lot of people in Congress who like mass transit and bike trails. So it's pretty hard to pass a skinny down bill that directly targets roads and bridges. And so where we are is before the end of this month, we will pass a highway bill of some duration. And I cannot tell you how long the duration will be. But the fact that we're not going to raise the gas tax, and we probably can't shift the bike funding and the mass transit funding into roads and bridges, make this not what you'd like. I mean, you'd like to have a 5 or 6 year bill. I would too. The question is, how do you pay for it? So we're going to do something. I just can't tell you with certainty how long it's going to be, how long a period it'll cover.
Secondarily, our council has been challenged to raise the minimum wage here. Any minimum wage talk in the Capitol? Thank you.
On the minimum wage, we're not raising the federal minimum wage. As most of you know, the principal beneficiaries of minimum wage jobs are young people, many of them in the restaurant business. The last thing we need is fewer unemployed young people. So I think from a public policy point of view, it's a bad idea. And I said that last year during the campaign. My opponent brought it up on a daily basis because it polls well. You know, when you ask people, you think it'd be a good idea to give everybody a raise, they say, yeah, why not? With regard to being majority leader, honestly, I just love it. You know, every senator has one vote, but every senator is not of equal influence. And the ability to set the agenda and control the flow, even in a body that is pretty freewheeling. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the Senate, we have no rules of germaneness and unlimited debate. Let me explain that to you. That means if you've got a defense bill on the floor and somebody wants to offer an amendment on agriculture, they can. And if you can't get everybody to agree to let them have a vote, you'd have to file cloture, that is a petition, and get 60 votes, and that takes you 2 days to get that. In other words, I spend most of every day begging, pleading, and cajoling. But in spite of all of that, it's, you know, this is a position I wanted for a long time and felt that I could handle. And it's really been a joyful experience. As odd as that sounds to some of you, it's really been a joyful experience to have the opportunity to do that. And I hope you all feel good about having a Kentuckian in a position like that. We had one other, Alvin Barkley, who was the leader of the Democrats during the Roosevelt years. And it's been a great experience. And I'd like for it to last longer than the next year and a half.
Hi, Senator Mike Sweeney with the FOP. Given the latest unilateral move by the president and his, quote, normalizing relations with Cuba and opening up these 2 embassies yesterday, is there any pressure that the Senate can put on the president to try to ask for extradition again given we got 70 people who have sought asylum in Cuba from the United States, including one cop killer who has been over there, I guess, for almost 40 years now?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm having a hard time figuring out what we got out of this. You know, you would think that the normalization of relations with Cuba would be accompanied by some modification of their behavior, which is what you're talking about. I mean, it's a haven for criminals who did bad things up here. You mentioned one of them. And I don't see any evidence at all that they're going to change their behavior. So I doubt if we'll confirm an ambassador. They probably don't need one. There's a lot he can do on his own. Some of the restrictions on Cuba would require legislation to lift, and we're going to resist that. It's a thuggish regime, and who knows how it works out down the future. Now, his gamble is that by normalizing relations and interacting with them more, their behavior begins to improve. We'll see. But it is a police state that's mired in the 50s and 60s. If you've seen any film of down there, they're still driving cars that are in the museum here. Cars from the 50s and 60s in use. They must be pretty good mechanics. So I don't know how it ends, but I do think it's going to be resisted. Let me just add a word about the president overseas. I can't think of a single place, not one, where we're in better shape now than we were when he came to office. Not one. We're part of the world. And it all began with his major speech in Cairo back in 2009 to the Muslim world, in which he seemed to question American exceptionalism and say, well, if we just all talk to each other more, things would be better. Well, we've been talking to the Iranians, and all of our Sunni Arab allies, like the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Gulf states, are completely freaked out about the fact that we may cut a bad deal with their biggest enemy in the neighborhood. We had a chance 3 or 4 years ago to topple Assad and hesitated. Putin looks at all of this and he thinks the single biggest geopolitical disaster of the previous century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. So he said, I think I'll take Crimea. And they said, well, I think I'll take some of eastern Ukraine. One of the best speeches I ever heard was last September. It was by the new president of Ukraine, who's actually very sharp. And here was the crux of his address to a joint session of Congress. Thanks for the blankets. We've sent them blankets and meals ready to eat. You know what they want? They want weapons to fight the Russians and to defend eastern Ukraine. And we won't even give them anything to fight with. So I think the president's foreign policy has been an unmitigated disaster. The only thing he's done that I think really helps us overseas is this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement that I think is going to come together, which does have a foreign policy and defense component in the sense that not only do they want to get closer to us commercially, they want to get closer to us militarily as well. And that's a good step. But virtually everywhere else, I think it's been America in retreat. And let me say, just because I'm not suggesting that we start sending in troops everywhere, but by the time he came to office, the Iraq War was won. It was over. And all we needed to do was to leave behind what all of the military wanted to leave behind, which is a residual force of about 10,000 troops for ongoing training and for counterterrorism for what purported to be the Iraqi military. As you know, its specialty is throwing down its weapons and running. So that's how we lost Iraq after winning it. He's got an opportunity here to not throw away Afghanistan, because the military, once again, is recommending leaving behind a residual force. Remember, we've had good luck with that. We did it in Germany, we did it in Japan, we did it in South Korea. We still got troops there all these years later. Worked out pretty darn well. And I hope he won't just rigidly insist on taking us down to an embassy presence in Afghanistan before he leaves office, because it's the wrong thing to do. So it's hard to think of much of anything from a foreign policy and defense perspective that I think he's gotten right. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any favorites in the crowded Republican?
Well, obviously I'm going to support my home state colleague, Rand Paul. And let me just say, if you look at the field, think of this year's Derby. There were just a lot of good horses and a big field. In 2012, I don't think we had a great field. I think we nominated the candidate who had the best chance of winning, even though he didn't. But this is a good field. I'm not worried about having a big field. I think the reason so many people are running is they think it can be won. Look at the Republicans in Kentucky right now. When I started my career, we had to beg people to run for office, and all the primaries were on the Democratic side. Last year, I had a primary, my opponent didn't. This year, we had a spirited primary for governor. The Democrats didn't. I think primaries typically are a result of people concluding the general election nomination is worth having. And so we've got a lot of very, very sharp candidates. And each of them, just like that field in the Derby, is trying to find some hole to go through, some angle, some way to differentiate themselves from the others. I don't think it's going to be unnecessarily brutal, because as you saw in the Kentucky governor's primary, if you get in a fight with somebody else in a multi-field candidate, you could end up taking yourself down and whoever you're feuding with down, and somebody else benefits from it. So I think they're all going to be walking kind of like on eggshells, trying to figure out how to get through the field. But look, at the end of the day, I think there's a good chance we're going to have a nominee who is very electable, a nominee who's going to look like the future, as opposed to the Democratic nominee who's going to look like the past, and a third term for what's been going on. So it just may take a while, and if you enjoy this sort of stuff as I do, it'd be fun to watch, to figure out who that is. But I'm not at all upset about having a big field. Okay, who wants to be the cleanup? Yes,
I've
sir.
got one over here. Brad Farley with Lockheed Martin. You've obviously built a respected career as a conservative politician. As a member of a younger generation, it's clear you had mentioned previously about changing demographics and how that might affect our country. The younger generations typically lean more liberal, and it seems to be picking up steam now. How did you get your start as a young conservative politician, and what advice might you give some of the younger members of the crowd as far as being active or pursuing a similar career?
Well, it's interesting that Ronald Reagan, who was at the time the oldest person ever elected president, did pretty well with younger voters. I tend not to put large groups of voters in any particular camp, like all women or all young people. I do think it appears from all the survey data that younger people are more liberal on social issues. I think it's not at all clear yet how good they feel about all this other stuff that I've been talking about today. So I don't view that as a group you cannot appeal to. Another group of Americans that a lot of people talk about are Hispanic Americans, our largest minority group now. We have a Hispanic Republican governor of Nevada, Hispanic Republican governor of New Mexico, 2 of 3 Hispanics in the U.S. Senate are Republicans. That is a very large block of voters as well. And I think it's a mistake to kind of generalize about how big blocks may go. There is one block of voters that we have not done well with, and that's even before the president came along, and that was the African Americans. But with others, I think there's more potential for movement. And so I'm not concerned about that. 3 of our candidates for president are not even 50. And so to the extent that they look at the individuals running, there's an overwhelming likelihood that whoever our nominee is going to be younger than Hillary Clinton, or maybe substantially younger. And at least 2 of them are fluent in Spanish, which in today's America is no small asset. So I'm not depressed about the possibility of appealing to younger people. The president certainly did. The president did extraordinarily well with younger people, particularly in his first election. He did a little bit less well in the second one because at that point the novelty had kind of worn off of who he was, and people were more inclined to look at the record. But I don't think younger people are irreparably lost. I think it's going to depend on the candidates and how they run the campaign. Okay, well, I'm going to get to one of these doors here and shake hands with as many of you. Which one? This one? Anyway, thanks for the chance to be here. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.